I am so glad you are here with us today as we start our new journey into the book of Esther. I'm going to pray for us, and I'm going to give a little bit of background on the book before we go in and start reading the first chapter. So if you would, pray with me. Dear gracious Lord and Savior, we are so thankful for the stories that you give us in the Bible, the ways in which we can see the past come to life, and the lessons that they have for us today. Be with us in our reading and in our understanding. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So I've got a really short PowerPoint to help me keep on track and not miss too much. And so I'm going to share that with you. The book of Esther is one of two books in the Bible named for women. Do you remember the other one?
Ruth.
The book of Ruth, another one of my favorites. And both of these stories are very much stories. They're not like a book of the prophets. It's very much, here's a story, here's a narrative. And it's really cool. So a little bit of background on the book of Esther. It is also known as the Purim story. It is read every year by people of Jewish faith.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Susan can share with some of that. It is a very happy, festive time. It's a celebration. You'll see later at the end of the book that Esther calls for it to be a continual reminder, celebration of what has been done for the people. When they read the story, it becomes very interactive. When the good guys do something good, or like you hear the name Mordecai, there's cheers. When you hear the name Haman, there's boos. So it's very, very much something that people can look forward to. There's usually a party, special cookies called Haman's Ears. We get them at the food pantry. Yes. So it's really cool. So the main king during this time is Xerxes. That is the Greek name. Your Bible may use the Jewish name, which I'm going to like completely butcher. And I don't think I have it in front of me right now. Hold on one second, and I might be able to pull it up. Or it's Arahuas or something like that. Different versions will use that. Same person, just different name based on different languages. Xerxes, we know that Xerxes existed. Xerxes reigned. We have historical evidence that Xerxes reigned between 486 and 465 BC. If you ever saw the movie 300 and the Spartans, this was the Xerxes that they fought against. He is well known for his loss to the Greeks. He is the son of Darius, so you'll remember that name as well. And he was not a friend of the Jewish people. Sometimes it's thought that it was only because of Haman's influence that the Jewish people had problems, but Xerxes himself was not a fan of the Jewish people, and he stopped the work that was being done in Jerusalem and in the temple that Cyrus had kind of declared would happen. Now, we don't have anything in the Bible to give us evidence to this, but it is Jewish tradition that Vashti was a granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, so the daughter of Belshazzar. That might give us a little insight into some of her actions as she goes about. She would have been considered part of the conquest when the Medo-Persians took over from Babylon. Also, another note for historical reference, when we talk about Haman, he's going to be one of our main characters. He is referenced as being an Agagite, so of the family of King Agag. He is someone that King Saul back in the day when he was fighting his battles was supposed to completely destroy and kill, but King Saul thought that he could give more mercy than what God was asking for him, so he spared the life of this king. And Haman is a descendant of this king. Mordecai and Esther are said that they are of the tribe of Benjamin. They're descendants of Saul's family. There is some tablets on what is called the Tomb of Esther that give the genealogy that trace them back to King Saul and King Saul's father. When we read, I think it's in chapter 2, we'll find it. Genealogies sometimes squish things and leave people out. They do say that they are a descendant of King Saul's father. So it's very quite possible that you have these two royal families adding conflict. So keep that in mind too as we're going through. There's a couple themes that I think are really important for us to think about as we are going through the book of Esther, as we're reading it. One, God's sovereignty, which is really interesting because God is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther. And some people wondered if the book of Esther should even be included in the canon because God is not mentioned by name. However, there's talk about fasting. And anytime there was fasting, prayer is associated with fasting. So God is implied. But we'll look at the idea of God's sovereignty and how God puts different pieces in place. Because there's a lot of things that happen in the story of Esther that it's like, oh, this was a stepping stone for this, which was a stepping stone for this. All of those quote unquote coincidences that are not coincidences. So we'll see God's sovereignty in that. There's also the theme of service. Mordecai working in service for the king and the government, Esther in service, Haman in service. What does it mean to be in service? Another big question and topic is that of obedience. Who's demanding obedience? Who is being asked to give obedience? Who does give obedience? What is the cost of disobedience? All of those come into play. As well, one of the big ones that we see all the way throughout from just about every single person, we see it in Mordecai, we see it in Haman, we see it in the king, we even see it in Esther towards the end of the book, is that of pride. So those are a couple big major themes to be thinking about as we are reading the book of Esther. And that's all I have on the background there to share. Just kind of give you a couple quick ideas. A lot of people, when they think of Esther, they think of almost like a Disney movie. You have this little, ragamuffin girl who was this nobody who becomes a queen. We'll see it's actually a lot deeper than that as it goes in. We don't know who wrote the book of Esther. It is thought that it was a Jew. I'm getting some of this from the Archaeology Bible. So I'm just going to read what it says real quick about the authorship. The unknown author of Esther appears to have been a Jew based on the book's emphasis on Jewish nationalism. So it's very much about Jews becoming a nation, the nation of Judaism, and on the origin, observance, and perpetual commemoration of the Jewish festival of Purim. It is thought that the author lived in a Persian city because of all of the Persian customs and the knowledge that it took to know all that information. And it's setting in the Persian capital of Susa. They're not sure exactly when it was written. It may have been written around 460 BC, which would have been shortly after everything occurred, but before Ezra went to Jerusalem. And the latest date suggested is about 350 BC, which is right before Greece conquered the Persian Empire. So we're not 100% sure who wrote it or when, but we kind of have a good 100-year idea of when it was written. And it was written, thought by a Jewish individual for a Jewish audience. So that should have some. Any other questions on the background of Esther?
How old was she? Since they seem to have a custom of very young brides.
Yes, so quite possibly she was a teenager. She would have, in order to be eligible for marriage, she would have at least had started her menstrual cycle. But if she was too much older than in her early teens, she already would have been married at the time. And it would have been great sin to have someone who was married then be gifted to be married to someone else. There is some thought that when Mordecai took her in, that she became like his wife, but that really doesn't work for her to have taken on that role. She may have taken on the duties, like the household duties, but not the bedroom duties of a wife, because that would have made her ineligible to be part of the king's beauty pageant, which was kind of like human trafficking. They didn't have a choice. And we'll get into
I was thinking she was hardly more than a child.
Probably not.
And she was Jewish, and the king was prejudiced.
Right. So
he didn't know she was Jewish.
Right, which is why it was essential for her to hide her Jewishness. And that again is going to bring up that idea of pride. He was too proud to have put value on Jewish people, and the pride necessary for her to lie about who she was. So kind of all of that will kind of fall in there. But that'll come up more in chapter 2. When we talk about
complicated.
Some of that. It's very complicated. And we're making a lot of judgment calls on a history that we were not a part of. A lot of things that happened in the past, whether it be thousands of years ago or even just 1 or 2 years ago, there's a lot that we can be sad about in our world history. And we try to look for the good parts, but it's also important to notice those other parts as well and not be afraid to talk about them and what we can do better, right?
And not repeat the mistakes.
Right, and it can give us a fuller understanding too of how God is with people. So we'll see how God is with Esther when none of her life is anything that she has any choice over, and how God is still with her. So.
Well, and it kind of seems to me that, hi, this is Marcia. I'm sorry I was a little bit late.
You're okay. We're glad to have you.
Anyway, yeah, that part of this story is about when we fail to do what God told us to do, that he has plan B or C or X or Y or Z in the wings, and he's not limited completely. I mean, it does make a difference if we're obedient, but I've heard people talk about the fact that Mordecai and Esther were still in Persia when they were told, the Israelites were told to return to Jerusalem, and that never would have happened to her if she'd been back in Jerusalem. And the other thing is, that Saul failed to kill all of the Amorites?
Yeah, King
Agag. The other king.
Yeah, and so something really bad happened because of that. Their lives were really threatened, but ultimately God wins. And in spite of our lack of following his guidance, and whenever we do something that he said we shouldn't do or we should do, we don't do, there are consequences, but God still says, one guy that I really enjoy is Stephen Arterburn, and he says, God says, well, I can work with that. Mm-hmm. Whenever we make a mistake, God is not limited. He can't, it's not like over. Sometimes it is, but usually he can use that as an ultimate blessing or an ultimate victory. And that's kind of a theme in Esther too, is, in spite of our failings and the failings of people around us, because Esther obviously didn't have a choice of not being in Persia. She was way too young, but when our parents fail us by dying or not taking us back to Jerusalem or whatever it is they do, or when our leaders fail us by not doing what God said they should do, like Saul failed to kill every man, woman, and child and animal. And that does sound really harsh, but this is the ultimate result of not obeying that. So there are always consequences when we fail to obey, but God still can work around that, and still his glory can be shown.
Right. And sometimes our consequences that we see are going to be immediate, and sometimes we may not see them for years and years. And then sometimes it'll be the next generations that sees them, both for good and bad.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. So let's get into reading. And I think we should be able to do the first chapter tonight. So let's check, and we'll break it up into half. Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. Who would like to read that for us?
I could do that.
Thank you, Karen.
And I'm reading from the New King James Version. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do it according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bithza, Harbona, Bigtha, Abitha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him.
All right, so we've got a lot going on in this first section. I've got a question. How many of you have ever been at a party that lasted for 6 months?
Never.
So this is a big deal. One of the thoughts is that this was kind of a strategy meeting. The idea, we're told by one of the historians, is that the Persians drank whenever they deliberated in matters of state. They believed that being intoxicated helped them to be in closer touch with the spiritual world, and that they would get guidance on how to best rule. Most people I know, when they are drunk, do not know anything about good guidance. That's when you make all your bad decisions. That's just been my experience, but this was kind of one of their rituals. Peter.
It's interesting they weren't forced to drink.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Usually that would be kind of insult to the king or royalty, but here it said no, they weren't forced to do according to each one.
Right. And so they were allowed to drink as little or as much as they want. So they were given kind of freedom about what they wanted to do, which is interesting because that freedom isn't always given to other people. Right. We see the king getting mad when Vashti decides to exercise some of her freedom. Anything else stick out to you about these sections?
Pride.
Well, the queen didn't have any choice. Well, she took a choice. I once read this story written like in something contemporary, and from Vashti's point of view, she was not going to dance naked in front of the king and his friends. And the writer of the story applauded her for that. So I think there's more to that story than we might realize.
Right. There's
it wasn't like he wasn't showing her off as much as controlling or trying to control her.
Right. It wasn't wear your crown with your crown with your royal robes. Notice it only talks about her wearing a crown. So it's quite possible he was saying you need to parade yourself around to be another object of my conquest. Because remember, the thought process in tradition says that Vashti was part of the conquered Babylonian realm. And so here we have the king planning a new conquest. So let me show everybody what it looks like to conquer. And I'll parade out my trophy. Karen,
that sounds like drunken thinking.
You know, they call it the male gaze for a reason. Karen, you were going to say something about pride.
Oh, yes, the whole first verses there are just, he's got to show off everything, like everything he's got. He's got a lot of good stuff, though, too.
Right. And so like in mine in verse 7, it makes special note that the goblets of gold, each one of the goblets were different, which means they were not mass produced. You could easily make a mold and fill it and have 50 of the same golden goblets. But no, these are each individual. That takes a lot of work, a lot of craftsmanship, a lot of money, a lot of effort. Right. Yeah.
Apparently that was the message he wanted to get across.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of toys.
Yeah.
I think there's something else that and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my take on it. You know, we've just done Isaiah and then we did James, New Testament. And now we're doing Esther. And I'm somewhat familiar with Esther. Although in Judaism, you don't really, except for the Pentateuch, you really don't need to do much reading. I had no idea what was in Isaiah. But, you know, James, even though there's works involved, it's all about reconciliation. And in Esther, I see vengeance, and it increases until the very end of the book. Unlike in the New Testament, reconciliation, forgiveness. Because it ends, you know, in this great joy that Haman's swinging and Mordecai is singing. Shoshana long ago. I mean, you know, it's a theme. It's you know, with it, whatever, you know, whether I'm a Christian or not, I'm not even sure. But with my encounter with Jesus, at least, it changes the way I think of Esther, and I don't see any happiness in it, even in the end. I just see it as, you know, he got his just due, and there's no real. It's not that loving forgiveness that I expect out of the New Testament. And I'll shut my mouth. I probably shouldn't have gone off on that.
You know, you're right. We'll see later that Esther asks for an extra day of vengeance. So there is a lot of that. So part of the moral in my mind of the book of Esther is what happens when you lead out of frustration and anger.
Okay.
Ed, you need to unmute yourself so that I can hear what awesome things you have to say.
Well, that was kind of off.
In the New Testament, there's some reconciliation that didn't happen either. Jesus was crucified, as I remember.
Yeah.
And that needed to have a lot of reconciliation. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
I'm missing something, Ed.
How's that?
What?
What are you missing?
Well, there is reconciliation on what happened when he said it is finished.
Well, yeah, but when the priests and the Pharisees never did reconcile their differences
Oh,
between
okay,
Jesus.
okay. But we have that opportunity. I mean, once it was finished, the opportunity was there. And in Esther,
So I think one of the things that is important for us to realize that there's some reality in this, in Esther, and we see it in the rest of the Bible too. Not everything ends with a happy ending. It's not that Disney fairy tale.
In Psalms, in almost every book of the Bible, David had a rough life.
yeah,
But he kept turning to God.
good point.
Because the Jewish people, even at the end of Esther, are still being oppressed. They don't have their own nation. They haven't left their captivity. So this is still part of that period of time that Isaiah has prophesied is going to happen. Yeah.
My footnote in my Bible
don't
also
you think-
says,
Let's go to Jill and then we'll
Go
do
ahead.
Marcia.
Yeah.
my footnote in my Bible also says that Vashti, she feared the gawking of the crowd and the drunken officials, but also the commoners. So towards the end of the time, it wasn't just the bigwigs that were there, but it was everybody. It was
Right.
a mixed crowd.
Yeah, and they probably would not have kept their hands to themselves.
Yeah, I thought that too. I mean, if any of you have ever been to a drinking party, you would not want to be parading naked around in that crowd. I mean, just the disgusting remarks and the looks, and maybe they would be afraid to touch her, but it would just be so disgusting and demeaning. And for him to even ask her to do that was just a really unloving thing to do. Obviously, she was totally objectified, not thought of as a person. You know, if he just wanted to show her off to the masses, you know, you can totally understand why she said no.
Which, that's a big thing, to say no to the king.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she was taking her life in her hands when she did it. Of course, you don't know what their relationship was. Maybe she thought she could get away with it. Or maybe she was so disgusted she didn't care. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to know, but...
And my footnote says that maybe, she was hoping for forgiveness after the fact. So maybe there was a relationship there that she was thinking that there would be forgiveness later, but...
Right, once he sobered up. Yeah. Sophia has a comment?
We see it nowadays, even in our generation, in other countries in Middle East or in England, people are bowing for human beings, the way they want to be treated instead of bowing for God. We still happening that people are focusing on this royalty, how people get treated. So that's what I would just want to mention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we get a couple other key players that come in. There's these 7 guys with these wonderful names that Karen did a great job saying, and they are eunuchs, which kind of gives us an idea that they are going to be working with the king's harem. They are able to talk to Vashti. It was a big thing, of course. Anyone in charge of a harem would not be allowed to have the opportunity to have an heir. They need to get rid of all of that temptation. So these guys were probably castrated, and this was their life, taking care of these women. And they spent their time there. So let's keep going, and we're going to go to the end of the chapter and see what the king does when he is furious and burning with anger. So Esther chapter 1, verses 13 through, I think it's 22. Who'd like to read that for us? Esther 1:13 through 22.
I can do that.
Thank you.
Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. And Memucan answered before the king and princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people.
All right. So did the king decide for himself what he should do?
Oh,
No.
Well, he asked for counsel.
He asked for counsel. It's interesting, again, so this number 7 comes up over and over in the Bible. There were 7 eunuchs, 7 nobles in his council. Just kind of an interesting note that is in there. And so we see some foreshadowing of what's going to come later. The idea that a king's decree cannot be repealed, it cannot be undone. We see that here. We see that a decree goes out to everybody in all the lands and all their languages. That's going to come up again later. That's important. We don't know what the doing away with Vashti meant. Was she killed? Was she just banished? It doesn't explicitly say. Different people have different ideas about what that could be. In either case, she was persona non grata. Right.
It seems to me, that she assumed that she could say no and he would forgive her, or she maybe wouldn't have done it. But the other thing about that is that, maybe she was put to death, but, when you disobey the king, that could mean instant death. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen to her. And maybe one reason that he asked his advisors is because he was kind of heartbroken about that, because he really did love her and he didn't know, maybe he didn't trust himself to make that decision. I don't know. It just seems to me that maybe he did love her. And so this was a solution to an unsolvable problem, which is he didn't want to kill her, but he felt like he needed to do something and he wasn't really sure what that would be. So he asked his advisor to help him, asked his advisors to help him figure out what he should do. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it just seems like, a commoner that said no would have been just killed outright, It seems like, probably.
I
for
Well,
that.
she dared to refuse him. And I picture her reply to his command was, not me, you stupid jerk. I mean, I think they had that kind of relationship, and he would have missed her if she was completely gone, if she was dead. He might have kept her around in a shabby little house on the palace grounds, maybe.
I would note that most political marriages during this time had nothing to do with love, and they usually hated one another.
Yeah.
If you look at historically, I think it is just personally, I think it's reading into it to think that they had a loving relationship the way that we would think that someone has nowadays.
Well, it
But-
also could have been that she was very powerful, that she was, part of a really powerful faction, and he didn't want to displease all those people as well,
Right,
Because obviously, for some reason, either whether it was she was depending on his love or on her position, she was not afraid to say no, which is very unusual in that kind of a setting.
So it also could be she'd gotten to the end of her rope where I've done enough and now it's time. I need to put my foot down, because that happens too. Like, I've just had enough.
Yeah, well, living with a 6-month-long drunk would be enough to try anyone's patience.
Xerxes is not known as being a good man. That's not something that he is well known for throughout history. So something to think about. So what do you think about this advice from his noble, Mamukin, that she's not only standing up for herself, she's being a horrible example, and we need to put all women in their places because she dared defy the king.
I just read the Message Bible here. It's kind of
Go
clever.
for it, Jill.
It says that 16 through 18, the day the wives of Persia and officials get wind of the queen's brazenness, they'll be out of control. Is that what we want? A country of angry women who don't know their place? That's pretty clever.
I will say that very well could have been written today.
Yeah.
You see a lot of that now. You see a lot of fear of feminism, the idea of, if we take away power from one, then that means someone else is going to oppress them, versus choosing equality instead of one always has to be above the other. One thing that is interesting, one of the commentaries I was reading brought out that in Hebrew, when it talks about relationships, and it actually doesn't use the word husband and wife. It is man and woman. So in Genesis and all that, it's she is his woman, he is her man. And so it's not really wife and husband the way that we say it. And so there's a little bit of ownership on both sides. Never once in the Hebrew scriptures is a spousal relationship referred to as master and slave, master and servant, when it's a true relationship. Now, there are situations in the Bible where a slave is abused and used in a wifely manner, but she was never intended for that purpose. She was kind of taken for that purpose. So this idea, Hagar, the Jacob's other wife, Jacob, the mother of Jacob's other children.
Jacob and Leah both. Yeah.
Yes. And so that's another way to know of how detestable this wording and this type of command would be to the Jewish people. They would have thought this repulsive, this command.
The analogy that strikes me, and I don't even want to use analogy because it's basically history repeating itself with the slave ownership.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, these were people brought over in chains, but moreover, in the South, because they were so numerous, they were not allowed to learn to read and write. And the slave owners were not allowed to teach them because they were afraid that they would rise up and rebel. And it's identical. It's just history repeating itself.
Well, and we see it in the way the Taliban these days treats the women.
Oh, yeah.
They're not allowed to go to school. You're not allowed to have jobs and make money. It's a lot of the same ideas here. Sophia makes a good point in the chat that in some countries, many countries, people didn't marry because of love. They married either just to have children. They needed to pass on their legacy. They needed to pass on their inheritance. They had a business that needed to keep going. There was a property that they needed to merge. Lots of times people were promised to each other when they were infants and only met on their wedding day. Sometimes those relationships did evolve into love and respect, and sometimes not. So the idea of relationship for love is a very Western idea, but is not always. Yes.
It's also very biblical because the Bible is full of love stories. Jacob and Rachel and I can't think necessarily of more Christ and his church. You know,
yes.
I mean, the first, I mean, you know, the prince rides down through the skies on a white horse and rescues his bride from the dragon. You know, I mean, that's like the quintessential fairy tale in its revelation. So, you know, God is very romantic, and husband and wife, you know, back in Isaiah, we talked about, you know, the nursing mother and her baby and the bridegroom and his bride, you know, and the shepherd and his sheep, you know, but in Jewish, I mean, in the Bible, women are, you know, Sarah and Abraham, they're pretty equal. You know, and I think one of the reasons God said that kings should not have many wives was because, you know, if you have women that are relatively equal to you, you can't have a whole bunch of wives. I mean, that would just be awful for the guy. You know, no man in his right mind would choose a bunch of independent American women to be his wives. You know, in polygamy in America, those women are very downtrodden and kept under, and they have to keep sweet, and they have nothing to say about their lives. Their kids are taken away from them, their husbands are taken away from them, and they're given to someone else. You have to keep women under if you're going to treat them that way, because otherwise they'll rise up and rebel, which is exactly what they were talking about here. You know, if women start getting uppity and thinking they can say no to us, then they're going to be out of control, you know, and that's not really a biblical view of women or a ancient Israel view of women.
So Marsha, I'm going to disagree. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I agree it is not the Eden ideal, is not God's ideal, that it not be out of love. I'm going to say that history, and in the Bible we see lots of stories that sin invaded relationships, and there was power that was not shared. People do not share power well. Sarah was given away twice by her husband that supposedly loved her in order to protect his own life. There's lots of things that go on that are not God's plan or God's desire, and not God's ideal. But I think it's important for us to note that, again, the romantic ideal of relationship is not necessarily what we see in the Bible. And so it's been misused in order, the sin that's infested it has been misused in order to make it God's norm that women need to be underneath, because what will happen if women are allowed to speak their mind? It'll be chaos. But that's not
well, and clearly
what it is.
Yeah, women were never totally treated equally, but there were relationships where it was more equal, you know. Song of Solomon is another love story. Yeah, but, you know, and you know, Christ and his church, obviously he's the head and we're the body. It's not like we're were exactly equal, but I think that probably in the Persian court, where they had a huge harem, and that was one of the things about all these state marriages. If you had 100 wives, you had, over 100 children, and you just gave your kids away as, a promise in a treaty without a thought. You did not value your wives or your children.
Right.
So that's why God said you shouldn't have a lot of wives, because then you can't be a good husband or a good father, because that requires attention. And so, but yeah, and as I remember reading this as a really strong feminist when I was in college and being completely disgusted by it, but I think it requires, if you're going to have a bunch of wives, it requires that you really keep them under control and squash them down, and don't give them independence, and don't let them tell you no, and don't let you, don't let them whatever, because otherwise there would be just chaos in your household and you'd be miserable. So you have to keep your women under control so that you can still be, and the king, and they'll all do your bidding. But yeah, but I don't think that's a biblical ideal.
And Marcia,
I was gonna say real quick, in that case, marriage is not about relationship. It's not about partnership. It's about either creating a workforce, you have lots of kids so that you have cheap free labor, or about treaties. It's not about relationship at all. It's about power and control one way or the other, which again is never God's ideal.
Never, no.
No.
And Marcia,
Susan?
to follow that, if you have 100 wives, there's no intimacy. And what we're told in Christianity is we want an intimate relationship with our Savior. Maybe that's the most startling contrast between the Old and the New Testament, is that the Old is about power and vengeance and anger and control, and the New is about, but I certainly saw in Isaiah a love story, an intimate love story.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
What Jesus does, and we see this in the Beatitudes, is he takes the old way of thinking, the corrupted way, and says, no, and flips it on its head and say, it's not about lording who you are over someone else, not about power. It's about self-sacrifice. It's not about money and riches. It's about love and care for one another. Jesus is constantly flipping the script and saying, you've misunderstood it, and you're corrupting it, and you're hurting people. And that has never been my intent. We need to fix it. And so Jesus was showing us and telling us, we got it wrong. Stop blaming God for our own problems. And as Jill noted, there's abuse of power in Esther. Yet God is able to work in these quite less than perfect life stories and give redemption and also give worth to someone's life. And so, yes, we need to see those that other people see as worthless through God's eyes, right? Exactly. Ed,
well, I was just
something?
thinking about the whole Bible is about God seeking reconciliation with whoever's alive at that time. And over through the whole Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, he's looking for reconciliation with his people. And he's still looking for it today. And we're pretty tough-nosed,
Right. Does God seek reconciliation because God screwed it up?
No, it's the other way around.
Right.
It's because he loves us.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe it isn't just because he loves us. Maybe he knows we can't live the way we do. I mean, the Jews, and I came from that culture, they're the most unhappy people you would ever know. It's just like when Daniel died, and I just obsessed upon suicide. I had a plan, I was setting a date, I was getting rid of stuff, but I was miserable. And I think that's why, not just because he loves us, that's probably an overriding factor, but it's also a father to his children, knowing that we just can't live with this grief and this sorrow and this estrangement. Does that make any sense to anybody, or am I just blowing smoke?
And what we do in response to that love, right? Because you see people hurting and your heart breaks, and God's heart breaks for us. And when we are hurting, we hurt other people, and we misrepresent God, and we cause chaos and strife where there should be love and belonging. God is not a God who desires abuse of any sort. Sadly, when people get into power, including church people or even family structures, the potential of abuse of that power exists.
Yeah, well, and actually, like the love story of Gomer and Hosea, he loved her so much that she took advantage of that, and his second child is called Not My Child. So clearly he knew, but what Hosea is full of, God tenderly pursuing Israel, and saying, your lovers are going to leave you and you'll be destitute, but come back to me because I love you and I'll take care of you. He's pleading with Israel to come back to him because he knows that we can't live on our own, but he also loves us and wants to be with us. And that is just amazing. That is just beyond understanding, that God desires us like that. And if you're a king with a harem of 1,000 women like Solomon was, you can't possibly love any of those women. Because if you love the first one, you wouldn't get the second one. And if you love the second one, you wouldn't get the 100th or 1,000th of them. It's just, it's that relationship has to be exclusive if you're really going to be intimate, and if it's really going to represent the kind of love that God has toward each one of us as though we were the only one. So it's such a perversion.
Well, and 1 second, Ed, and then I'll get you. So getting back to this Esther idea, what the nobles are wanting, notice they're men of power and position. Their wives are probably people of power or money or position. It's about dominance. Who can I dominate? Who can I lord my power over? Because I need to be seen as greatest. So I've got that pride factored in there. That is not a God's way of dealing with people, period.
Isn't that a perfect example of the natural man?
Natural human beings. Yeah. Ed.
That's
Women
what I
are
meant.
never like that, just men, right?
So too often we get confused whether we mean man or humanity. So I try to be clear about humanity.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ed.
Well, I was going back. I think God's reaction and the whole Bible is built from love.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. God is love. And he wants us to love even those who do bad things against us,
Mm-hmm.
We can't be close to God without love, because that's what he is.
Exactly. Well, we have run out of time for today. We will pick back up again next week, and we can talk a little bit more about the end of chapter 1 before we delve into chapter 2, so that we'll remember where we're at and why 3 years later Xerxes is looking for someone to replace his queen. But thank you for joining us, and please consider joining us next Wednesday as well. And we're going to stop recording so we can have some prayer time together.